In 3, 2, 1. Now, the biggest problem for newly formed democracies is unchecked power. Because when unchecked power exists, corruption thrives, inefficiency thrives, and people who are physically on the ground feel as if the state is not doing anything for them, and in reality that is necessarily the case. What we will prove to you is firstly that this new political party will have good incentives for better policy against this type of thing, but secondly, even if the other political party one day reassumes their office, they will necessarily have better incentives because there is competition on the block. But firstly, very important framing, in case they go, but tensions still exist, it's a problem. Firstly, new generations of people have most likely been created since this process has happened. These people are not tainted by the visceral images of the problems that existed in the past. These people have also most likely been co-opted by liberal messaging that exists from Western media like Netflix and how to say social justice and these type of things that they have seen, that they have internalized since younger age, which statistically makes them likely to be, how you say, more liberal. But thirdly, notice that, and this, I want to be very nuanced here, when this current political party comes into power, they did have incentive to stabilize the country. Because most likely some kind of conflict happened, either literal conflict from military states or some kind of uprising in this particular case. In order to stabilize, in order to engage in this type of thing, they have to do things like, for example, give somewhat some kind of concessions. Like, for example, what do you study in your school in terms of history? What kind of religious practices did you have in these particular months? No, the nuance here is, this is a, how you say, a time process. So as time goes, you are less likely to do these things and more likely to do bad things, but definitely in the beginning you have them. So you have some kind of benefits. This is for a new generation, but current generations also have these type of things because as time passes, they're more able to forget about the troubles that they had in the past and more likely to care about more proximate things to them. The money that they earn, whether or not they have a corrupt judge who will put them in prison wrongly in this particular case, which necessarily makes them care more about other things. Let's characterize the structure of the dominant political party. It is likely to be extremely corrupt. Why? Because you need to corrupt the system in order to consolidate your power because you fear losing this particular power. This looks like you, for example, appointing people to skew the democratic process in your place. Like, for example, appointing main prosecutor who doesn't prosecute you, or judges who will vote for you, or just simply doing things like buying out votes, right? Because people are poor, literally paying them, or buying out media outlets who are able to manipulate society with your messaging in these type of things, or generally control the levers of power. Where is funding allocated? To give it to a specific group of people that is in your political interest. No, this is again the nuance. This is a process. You cannot, like this, do it and tomorrow everyone is, how you say, in your favor. So most likely we are in the, how you say, middle period. So maybe 10, 15 years have passed in this particular moment. So they're now in the moment where they're rounding up these particular things. So the marginal benefits from this part have already been gotten and the process of bad political outcomes have started in this particular case. So we think the new challenger will necessarily challenge them in this sort of thing. So here's second characterization. Why will this election be, most probably have been done by a good platform in terms of good policies? And this is the crucial link. In order for you to win other political constituencies or constituencies from this political party, because obviously you have beaten a party that has been in power for so long, this may have at least have a majority or maybe in certain cases super majority in this particular case for them to be in power, you necessarily have to give them a message that people care about. Most likely you've talked about the bad policies that these agents have done, like the corruption scandals that you existed with their ministers, like for example allocating funding to this part but not to this part, like for example building a highway that's super inefficient and collapses in these particular cases, that are problems that people see, problems that people believe in, problems that people like. It is unlikely to be something super scandalous, right? Why? Because it's, how you say, it's to an extent counterbalanced, because to a certain extent people believe that some benefits have been gotten by the previous party, so in order for you to do this, you need to give to them the things that they care about. So we're not talking about party winning with radical redistribution, but most likely party talking about the corruption scandals, the problems in these type of things. Why is this thing likely to be structural, second thing here. Also, they're likely to be compromised by newer generations. People who've been, for example, business people who have worked in corporations that have come to this country afterwards, or people who have lived abroad, who have good incentives. Now, why do these people have good incentives? Firstly, the old party will still be a threat even if you win, right? There is a possibility where you, for example, may screw up something and they'll come on their white horse and say, it was better in our times in this particular case. So you have maximum incentive to do good policies that cater to the interests of these particular people and to uphold the standards that you have. But secondly, and this is pretty funny, you have second timer advantage in this particular case because you're now the second political party who is able to do this in these sort of things. So you're able to capitalize with these particular good policies, create the narrative that we were better than the bald guys before that in this particular case. We gave you, for example, the adequate highway, we stopped corruption in this particular case, we did all of these good things, but you can only do those particular good things when you're able to do all of these type of processes. Before I continue impacting this point,
If people can just get over historical trauma, why would you propose that the Croats, the Serbs, and the Bosniaks don't really like each other that much in Bosnia?
Okay. let's break the WUDC rules. They like each other actually, they do hang around. But like I'm from Balkans and most. But secondly, to answer this question, the nuances, maybe to a certain extent, this does happen. The problem is on aggregate what happens, right? What the average population. So yes, maybe some percent of people do, but most percent of people go forward. And secondly, people take pragmatic incentives that they have in this particular case for this sort of thing. Thank you, Naomi. This is the first funny POI you've given. Impacts. Let's do this. Firstly, money. How do you say? When you give money to corruption, this money is basically wasted because you give to cronies who are basically able to make their lives better in this particular case, and it's not given to good things like healthcare, infrastructure, and all these things that benefit the lives of people. It is mutually exclusive because you don't have infinite amount of money in this particular case. But secondly, level of services. When you appoint people that are your guys, you don't necessarily appoint the best people to do the job. You appoint people who are loyal to you to do the job in this particular case, who most likely not rat you out and not do these sort of things. Structurally, these people are likely to be not the most competent ones because it's not meritocratic system in this particular case. But on comparative, when the new political party is associated, you're better able to give it to better people who are better able to do these types of services. So if you're infrastructure minister, you're able to obviously appoint people who are more likely to do the project of the highway. Or if you're healthcare minister, you're able to appoint better people to do healthcare in these particular things. So this means that people on the ground who receive these type of services will benefit both monetarily from the government, but both in terms of these services, live better lives. But even if you don't buy that, even if this other political party tomorrow wins, or how do you say, is able to come in power, this means that they have to change their narrative in order to account for these particular things. Because they have been beaten in an election. In order to win back their voter base, they need to double down on being adequate, to say, okay, maybe we made mistakes in the past. That's why we have new brand of political people in this sort of thing. Okay, maybe this policy was not in particular good, that's why we propose another policy in this particular case, because that's the way you're able to win back your votes. This, look, obviously this is not going to be perfect. These people are not going to be magically Democrats tomorrow, but they're able to give at least some kind of beneficial policies, or at least give the illusion of a democratic process in this particular case. Yeah, so for all these reasons, we don't want unchecked power on their side of the house that will continue to go bad long term. We prefer to have some level of competition to make things better. For all these reasons, propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition.
It's important to note that even if this party is endorsed by the shittiest of majority members, the asymmetry of power is likely to be substantially less on our side, given the analysis I've given you on bargaining power networking and bargaining power networks and narrative power. Because in comparison, this new party just doesn't have the ability to pander to anyone but the majority that elected them. They have to do that because those were the ones who got them in power in the first place, given the fair party analysis I've already given. Second, then, is that this new party is unlikely to be liberal. Why is this true? 3 reasons. First, on the quality of politicians, I think it is likely that the highest quality of politicians within this nation are probably going to want to and will likely be a part of the dominant party. Why is this true? Because first, I think it's important to note that successful politicians probably want to gain access to the most amount of power. They want the most amount of ability to make change in the future because that reaffirms that they will be able to be elected in their region in the future. That means that if they want that, they know that the person who is the most in power will get that. But second, on the incentive of the dominant party to cater to and bring in these new successful politicians is that these parties want the best politicians within their party. The party wants the best politicians within their party in order to maintain their success in the future as well. That means if a new rise to power like AOC comes, I know that's not a developing nation, but this is a comparative, if AOC is coming into the Democratic Party will want to bring her in order to maintain the support of those individuals. What is important to note then is that new politicians, per their analysis, are likely to be liberal, but we have them more likely on the dominant party side as opposed to theirs. That means we're able to create more change. It's incredibly important that we maintain this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. back speech. I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the debate.
Now we have the chance to go to food or funny POS.
I may be out of stock.
Even the most liberal snowflake out there in the world, in their wet dreams, whenever they go to bed at night, dream to be like shipping, the other people who have actual power. This is a great opportunity for these people to meet in the middle and actually achieve that. Look, a lot of our characterization, essentially, and what the opening opposition proposes is we agree. We agree that this particular state is in okay relations and there is no likelihood of like huge abusements of minorities and things like that. Closing opposition cannot knife their own opposition in this particular case. You have to work within that particular framework. Now, the thing is, the first thing that I would like to respond is that you wouldn't like to change a particularly working strategy if you're at this new particular policy. So look, even if you, like during the elections, have a particularly aggressive narrative towards particular minority groups, just so you can sweep up the nationalists and things like that, it probably means that when you actually gain the power, you're far more focused on making sure that you do good things for most people, but even taking advantage of actually like locking in the votes for the next election of this particular minority group that previously haven't been as access to. But I also don't think that the average person in these countries, and like this is extremely important within the characterization of women, of like how we actually got there in the first place, and it's a fairly democratic country, like the average person in Serbia, Croatia, or whatever, they fucking hate the Serbs and the Croats and things like that, but this is mostly on an internal level. On outside level, on policy level, they would like to vote for things such as like less corrupt, such as like having access to actual jobs, the things such as like, for example, not being sued in court and things like that. And I think this is extremely important, especially in the cases in which many of these countries, because they have gone through a democratization process, it means that there is some like international level of cooperation. It means that like they have general incentive to show the world and their partners that they are not like some militant state that is oppressing minorities and things like that. This is unlikely to change on both sides of the house, meaning that the new rising party is still likely to continue the good things that have been happening for the minorities in the first place. But as they say, all cult of personality, exclusive narrative power. My first question to this is, okay, but what are the better things that this actor can do? I think comparatively, our actor on our side of the house, exactly because they don't have the cult of personality and all the levels of power, are likely to work much harder for it, because they would like to regain that culture of power. They would like to be as powerful as these individuals, but because they cannot do it and replicate it in fully, they would have to, do actual things for people, like give them anti-corruption policies, like give them the ability to act like promote infrastructure projects, maybe break up some very big corruptions and oligarchs' powers and things like that. But also, like, if they won in the first place, it means that the culture of cult of personality might be high, but not by like that high in particular. It's not an authoritarian state per se. So like if you are the person who beats Vučić in Serbia, it is unlikely that you won on the platform of I hate the Croats, the small Croat minority that lives in Serbia. It's probably you're still catering to the majority on both sides of the house to a certain degree. It doesn't really particularly matter, and I don't think it's going to be a tipping point issue for many of the majority people that live in that country, whether or not you're bad or good against minorities, especially since they have been probably much better in the last 15 years compared to them. I don't think that the average Serbian goes around on the street in the cross and they see the rich Croats in the cars and they hate them and they would like to remove them. These narratives are unlikely to exist. Even when you pander to the majority, it's most likely going to be equal on both sides of the house. I think that there are a couple of other important things. The comparative. You still, as this particular government, have access to a lot of the things that you've built up to this point. The code of personality, as Ovo says, your access and contacts in media, your ability to be presentable and recognizable in front of many of these people places. What does that mean? This party knows that, and if they fuck up, if they're too radical, if they completely change the levers, it means that you're likely to come again on the white horse and basically say, oh, look how this party did badly, look how I completely reversed things, look how they fucked up the economy and things like that. You wouldn't want that, because this is probably your last chance to basically impose yourself as the new power, and if you lose it, it's very unlikely that you're gonna win another elections, and your public image is going to be all over the place, and you're going to make the other dominant party even stronger, because now they're seen as the only alternative. Why is this important? Because it works on both comparatives. In one comparative, you're generally less likely to be radical while you're in power, but if you are radical in power, then it's better for us, because it means that on our side of the house, when that particular party comes back to power, it's still going to be a little bit better in that particular process. I think also, since the country has been through some sufficient level of liberalization and there's no major pressures and things like that, you're likely to now be in a position where you gradually increase your economy, but you're still looking to go into a next level, access like world economies, exports, trades, and do things like that, because you have cheap labor, maybe you're good at agriculture and things like that. Explaining that a little bit, but before that, Max.
So your point is that the dominant party right now is staying in power via corruption, cronies, and owning the bureaucracy. But once they're out of power, it is totally impossible for them to take advantage of those networks as they exist in the country. And they must win by being popular?
No, it means that they have been weakened to a certain degree where it's very hard for them to completely co-opt them. But if you keep fucking up, in people's lives, the narrative is going to change. Which means that you have an active incentive to give people a lot more as comparative as the new party, all of the policies that we've talked about, in comparison to what you're doing on your side of the house. Now, what does it mean to the world in this? You're now basically proving to the world that you're in fact a stable democracy and you have achieved that particular place. You signal to every other partner out there or international institutions that you are essentially a fairly stable country that has the particular independent institution on its own. Why is this good? Because it gives you access to liberal support, foreign aid policies, direct FDI. The people that are coming to your country know that they're not going to be demolished by the local oligarchs, but are in fact likely to have some checks and balance to them, which means money, power, businesses, jobs, all of these great things that we really, really love. This is what's important, because this is what the average person in a developing country has. You have the opportunity to do so. You just have to convince people that you are already at that level where their business is not going to be ruined by the ground by a corrupt government. Never been prouder to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'll call the second speaker to the opposition.
I think OG tried to be too witty for their own good, and if they listen to the second part of Kayla's speech, they'd understand why. Kayla proved to you two extraordinarily simple things. One, that these current parties have the incentive and the capacity to make the change to protect the minorities, and second, that these new parties are unlikely to be liberal and capable. So I'll start with the second one first because it takes out OG completely. How does new parties in dominant political situations come to power? So Kayla gave you 3 reasons. 1, it is disrupting the status quo by reigniting ethnic divides. Because if it is true that this dominant party has maintained stability and has created an image of stability about resolving ethnic divide and so on and so forth, the only way you can break that image of Awami League of not being secular is by showing that Awami League has categorically been washing out Hindu minorities. If that, because that's the only way you can show that Awami League isn't a very benevolent person and you shouldn't be continuing to support them. If that is the case, you as a new party have very like a lot of incentives of again bringing back old narratives of ethnic divide, inspiring aggression and protests against the dominant party, because the only way in which you get people to show up in the voting booth is if you have visceral change. Because again, they say that you have cured the historical issues, you have created stability, and you have taken control of the legislative branch, you have control over the media, but suddenly the thing that the dominant party has all control over, in that ground this new party will magically win. This clearly, probabilistically, can't happen. If that is the case, panel, I think there's more death and more oppression under their world. This significantly means more police brutality against these individuals. Second, majorities, again, having more microaggressions towards these minorities during this political cycle. This is horrible for them, just categorically, period. They needed to engage as to why this new party can play the game of this dominant party and win the election on stability. I don't think categorically they can. Second is the quality of personnel that Kayla talked about. That is that this dominant party is likely to have the best political talent. That is to say, the best negotiators, the most influential youth in certain neighborhoods. The reason for this is because they usually have youth wings, and this youth wing's job is to make sure to get the new world leaders. There is an incentive for both minority youth and majority youth to join these places. That this is important is because they know that being an Awami League politician is what guarantees them to take care of the neighborhood, take care of the family, etc., etc. Which means that the subsection of politicians in this new party, again, the only way they're effective is if they're uber left or uber right, which means that they're in both sides, the ultra left or ultra right. Which also means, panels, they're likely to be bad at negotiating if they come to power, and they're unlikely to get any meaningful change, because if you're not the best negotiators, you cannot. Under our world, if corrupt governments want to keep on building lineage, they take the best amount of youth, and again, I just think on a comparative, we win out. But the third reason as to why this new party is unlikely to be the best is simply because you have to pander to the majority more. That means, maybe yes, you unlock the minority demographic, but plus the minority demographic, you need a considerable amount of majority demographic, which essentially means that you have to cater to these majoritarian demographics significantly more. Because, because you can't show that, oh, I'm going to make radical change and I'm going to take all your money, take all, tear down mosques and build temples there and whatnot, or do any of these things, which means that similar incentive of pandering to the bourgeoisies, if they think that my first 2 mechanisms are untrue, then they they have to admit that they have to symmetrically cater to the majority. What does this prove to you? Simply, this proves to you, panel, that this new conception of this party is unlikely to be something that is good for economy insofar as it increases instability and doesn't have the right people in power to create the negotiations that essentially make the biggest policy change. More direct rebuttal. And here's the simple one, right? I think the biggest change is competition makes shit parties better, quote unquote. 1, I think the threat of competition is sufficient, because presumably as a big party, like when you see this new party arising and getting more and more seats in the parliament and potentially will like tip you off in the next cycle, you don't need to be out of power to essentially do this. Their existence is threatening enough, so all of the incentives I think apply. But second, I don't know why when the dominant party comes back under your rule, in which case you are conceding that there's a very high possibility that this is just a one-term thing. I don't know why they don't clamp down in their old ways. That is to say, why they don't do like place more amount of judges or funnel more money into like controlling the media so that this like blip in their dominant political like lineage doesn't happen again. I just categorically do not understand the benefit of this. Then, let's talk to you about why these parties are just have not only the incentive but the capacity to be better. I'm going to talk about the capacity first because I think that's the key differentiation. But before that, CG.
When parties remain dominant for long periods of time, do their ideologies remain static or do they evolve and become more radical?
The youth wing of Army League and this entire example of bringing in new talent would presume to you that they have an incentive to cater to the new generation because they understand basic math and they understand that they can't have people protesting in the streets and calling them old hags all the time, which means that they do have young politicians under our rule that caters to the new generation more than you. Alright, why is capacity alongside incentives quite important? Because panel, you can say that they have an incentive to be corrupt. Kayla gave you a host of reasons why they have the incentive to be forward-looking, to minimize disturbances, to be like, prioritizing economic development. There's mechs for both sides. But the differentiation is capacity, because you can have the incentive to create change, but if you don't have the necessary capacity in a developing country where the majority is very conservative to create change, that like jack shit is done for minorities. Here are the 3 reasons why Kayla told you that this big party has the capacity. 1, because they have pre-established networks, which according to OG's characterization, the new party does not have access to, right? So it's exclusively under our world. Second, you have more narrative power, which means that you have, again, according to the media control, keep the majority happy while giving more and more concessions to the minorities, and the backlash won't be as much because you have the iconography of Sheikh Hasina giving more parliamentary seats to Hindus, but like Jamaat still thinks she's like, pro-Muslim, right? For all of these reasons, panel, vote on both incentive and capacity, and therefore open.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the 3rd speaker for the government.
What's missing from this debate is the long-term analysis. Because opening government correctly established these states and their governments are kind of these parties are currently bad. Opening opposition try to refute this and say they're currently good. What we're going to bring you at closing government is an explanation of not just that they are corrupt currently, but that into the future, when they remain dominant, when they don't have the chance to have a circuit breaker election and be removed from power, what you're going to get is these parties radicalising, what you're going to get is these parties becoming more violent, more corrupt, more ethnically segregated in ways that are far worse. What happens when a party remains dominant? Because again, opening government's case largely revolves around corruption, which is bad, yes, but we're going to bring you bigger harms at closing government. We think there are broadly 6 of these. Firstly, you massively demoralise opposition groups when this party remains dominant forever. Because morale is a really important part of politics. You need people to believe in your cause. You need them to be willing to do things like donate, like volunteer their time, like join up to political party memberships, and actually become actively involved in the political sphere, engage in public discourse. When a party remains in power for longer periods of time, the morale of opposition groups tends to decline further. People give up. They accept the current state of affairs that this party is almost never going to lose an election. They tend to accept that they are unlikely to have any success, at which point they are likely to give up on the political process via democracy altogether. They are likely to not believe in their endeavours are worthwhile. They are likely to drop out, which means you end up with this party consolidating even more power by virtue of things like vote, not like active voter suppression, but people effectively don't turn out to vote. You get really low turnout elections, you get less accountable representative government. The second harm you get over long term is that institutional knowledge tends to get consolidated within this dominant political party. Because of the fact that they are the only ones who have held office for decades, they are literally now the only people in elected office who know how to run a government. And the opposition can never effectively learn. They're unable to get the skills to know how to run a ministry, to how to engage with the bureaucracy correctly. Which means that taking power in the future is substantially harder because these new governments will be inexperienced and unprepared and more prone to failure. They will be more prone to do all of the bad policy that opening half talks about. They are more prone to make mistakes that hurt millions of people's lives and livelihoods, which also flips a lot of opening opposition's material here about why these current governments are good. Because even if you believe that these current governments are good, when they consolidate power forever, that is very likely to result in no viable alternatives ever. They are able to get away with far more into the long term. Third harm of this over the long term is that these parties tend to absorb all of the people with talent who have incentives to enter the halls of power, who want to become politicians and politically influential. They are forced to bend the knee to this political party in order to gain influence in society, much like what we saw in, for instance, East Germany, when anyone who wanted to become politically influential had to join the Communist Party and subscribe to its ideology, even if they didn't fully buy into it. We think that's very likely what's going to happen. People are forced to become complicit because they know that is the only way they could reasonably expect to end up in government or in power. They're more likely to ascribe to a political party that they don't actually want to believe in, that they, for the sake of their career. Which means that people who might care about things like reform end up having to become corrupt, or end up having to become part of a political party which they actually oppose, simply because there are no viable alternatives, which means that any chance for public discourse and engagement massively decreases. You get the best and brightest people getting sucked up by this party, even though that is a massive harm. Fourth harm of this over the long term is in terms of legitimacy and the public perception of these governments. Because open government talk about the newer generation, but these newer generations are now often going to be growing up in opposition's world, where there is literally only one party that has ever been the government for all their lives. They have never known another government, and that gives these incumbent governments a sense of legitimacy. People, and in particular, it instills a fear of the unknown at future elections. People don't want to vote for change when they know that this government has run the show for 20 years, because the fear of the unknown is greater now, because they have no idea how viable this opposition party is going to be, which means that you need this circuit breaker now, or else into the future, the chance of opposition groups winning elections decreases even further. It makes it far harder to remove these parties in future. That is why we give you the sort of sense of urgency uniquely closing government. Fifth reason, which I flag in a point of information though, is that these parties don't remain static. They get emboldened when they remain in power for longer periods of time. Their ideology is not static. Viktor Orban got elected in Hungary as a fairly standard centre-right conservative, but only radicalised upon realising he had supermajorities, that his opposition was divided, that he had majority support from the majority McGill ethnicity in Hungary. Here's some structural reasons for why they radicalise. Firstly, they have more power with fewer checks and balances as they are able to install their own people in the bureaucracy, in the judiciary. Secondly, they're insulated from electoral accountability because they're able to rely on their ethnic majority, and the fact that in the vast majority of these sort of ethnic tension states we're talking about in this debate, there is often just one ethnic majority that is able to effectively just win. And noting that most elections are very much correlated with racial demographics. Look at Bosnia and Republic of Srpska, for example. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm not Balkan. But it's if you look at the actual results of those elections, it's literally just a perfect overlay of the racial demographic map. There is actually no accountability for a lot of these governments. But thirdly, often when these governments are in power, they empower their own ethnic group with things like cronyism and political appointments and giving them more economic power in society, and that plays into racial narratives. They are able to they're often able to promote their own ethnicity at the expense of others. The political youth groups that opening opposition talks about are ones which inculcate the ideology of an ethnic majority party. They are going to be way more radical if you think that young people are coming through. The young people who join these parties are the ones who are the most radical, the most likely to turn to things like actual violence in future. But sixthly and finally, taking opposition at their best, even if these parties aren't explicitly corrupt, which opening opposition bizarrely assert, you still force other actors in society to comply with their interests when they remain in power over the long term. Media like state broadcasters is hesitant to criticise them. The bureaucracy still wants to cater to their interests. Community leaders who want funding have to bend the knee to that party, all of which means that even if they're not explicitly corrupt, they end up gaining an enormous degree of institutional power. You need a circuit breaker to be able to fix that. I'll say closing.
Yeah. Presumably in the long term, if closing gut is correct and all the talent broadly throughout society coalesces in this party, then yes, there may be some youth-wing radicals, but there are also many more people who don't want to be radical and now have influence in the party.
No, because firstly, for the reason I already give you, when there is almost no accountability, there's actually not an electoral penalty, for example, for becoming more radical. And there are often internal incentives to sort of, rise in the ranks by, being more radical than your compatriots within the same party. Look at the Republican Party in the US, for example. So, I want to when you activate this circuit breaker, it signals to people that this party is not just the de facto state. You also, and this also responds, I think, to closing opposition's point of information. Because maybe it's true that other actors are in the old party's pocket, but only CG explains how you can break that cycle by breaking that perception that this is the permanent government, by making other political parties more viable and empowering them to be able to make change into the long term. This extension wins the debate for two reasons. Firstly, it adds an impetus to this debate, because corruption, sure, is bad, but the effective one-party states are disastrous, they are more emboldened, they are more likely to return back to ethnic tensions and raising the risk of violence. But secondly, our harm is by far the most long-term and most severe in this debate, because it's not just corruption, it's the fact that if they don't get removed from power now, it gets ever less likely into the future that they will ever face any level of accountability, that they will ever have any need to be representative of the people in their country. We add a time dimension to this debate that OG likes and amplify all of their harms exponentially. For those reasons, closing government.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the third speaker to the opposition.
On closing opposition, we think that the enemy that you know is better than the enemy that you don't. Sure, in major parties there's probably some corruption, maybe minor degrees of ethnic favoritism, but this is always going to be far better than the alternative, which Gov Bench decidedly just chooses not to characterize. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, how this disrupts the fragile ethnic balance that exists, and secondly, why it triggers a massive economic crisis. On disrupting the fragile ethnic balance, I want to start by characterizing why the incentives of larger parties is to form inter-ethnic patronage networks rather than oppressing them as closing government characterizes. The reason for this is, when you are no longer concerned about re-election, your primary goal as a dominant party is simply to guarantee stability and wealth maximization for the regime. Sure, your incentives for this might be perverse, like giving more money to your patrons, but it broadly just is your incentive because it basically allows you to get more rich. However, this incentive massively co-aligns with guaranteed degrees of ethnic stability. You don't want things like ethnic separatism within your state when resource-rich regions that contribute to the tax pool are going to break away. You don't want things like violent ethnic protests that can trickle down into ethnic war because that is going to scare away foreign investors. Therefore, even though you might have some nominal favoritism toward one ethnic group, you are broadly still going to give other ethnic groups basic economic minimums to prevent them from revolting within the state and to appease leaders to prevent them from encouraging citizens to revolt. Therefore, there is going to be some degree of inter-ethnic inclusion that is going to exist. I want to respond here to the closing government extension, where they basically say that the reason why these parties are so terrible is that power snowballs over time and therefore there is zero accountability. There's a couple responses. Firstly, internal accountability networks form within partisan structures. The vast majority of one party states have a myriad of factors that operate. Think to the ANC or the LDP in Japan because there are ideological differences and different factions within the party want power. This is valuable because you prevent geo-policy because different factions have different conceptions of what the ideal state ultimately is, and they also want to assume power from other factions. Note, these factional battles often exist behind closed doors to look at policy continuity, but you still have an internal mechanism to voice diverse preferences within the party. Secondly, if social opinion is changing, the party can just change too. Most dominant parties still have things like youth wings, bigwigs still tend to die out within the party. You can still get things like gradualist policy change under our state of the house. Given that incentives are broadly good under the status quo, how do they hugely disrupt this process? Because we think that the most natural cleavage that is going to form within the new party is going to be ethnicity, and they're going to respond to all of the OG preemption. The first reason for this is the emotional viscerality of past conflict. It is a lie that people forget about the trauma of the past. It was your grandparents who were killed in the war, but in most cases, this was literally 2 decades ago. People alive today lived under apartheid, right? They tell their children about this. People were murdered by Franco's regime. These are emotional scars of your families and of your parents who were killed during the war, creating huge degrees of intergenerational trauma. Why this matters is that even if you think that opening government is rationally correct, you care about getting more food, you want revenge when people literally killed your family. Secondly though, there's a lack of clearly defined political ideologies between different parties that ultimately exist. The left-right divide that has come to fruition in most Western states stem from years of policy institutionalization and differentiation between two parties, which doesn't exist with the recent closing government themselves gives, but there probably wasn't an established opposition. This then creates a degree of policy sameness across different parties, who are probably just saying, we're going to reduce corruption, we're going to feed your family, blah, blah, blah. But given that policies themselves tend to be relatively uniform, they then look for differentiating factors amongst parties. And the best way for parties to both differentiate themselves, but also for voters to differentiate parties when they're looking at the different platforms is on the basis of ethnicity, which is a very clear cleavage for parties to appeal to in the absence of having clear policy differentiation that's ultimately going to exist. How does this manifest? Firstly, during the electoral process itself, there's likely to be huge degrees of kind of ethnic rhetoric that's being used. We need to get into power to kind of remove the vermin who have been oppressing us from the past. Look to massive violence that was triggered in the 2008 elections within Kenya. But secondly, we also get policies that are being based on ethnic violence, or sorry, on ethnicity more when the minority party comes to power, because they don't have the same degree of inter-ethnic patronage networks, so therefore they're likely to appeal to their own ethnic group to a broader extent. In the short term, this can literally be a trigger for massive degrees of conflict. In the long term, even if the election themselves does not lead to conflict, at least a feeling of systemic marginalization, because you feel like you're locked out of power to a much larger extent when the degree of ethnic oppression is substantially larger. Note, even one community picking up arms, we have proliferation across the country when there's more arms and hatred increases when people are dying within one region. So to impact this, if there's any chance of a degree of violence, it is literally people dying in a massive economic crisis that's going to occur, but even the higher perceived risk of ethnic violence occurring, they have the massive chilling effect on FDI, and insofar as there's likely to be a perceived risk of conflict. Before I talk talk about an economic crisis opening.
You and all cannot have your cake and eat it too by saying that the situation has been getting better, but all of a sudden this new political party uses old trauma.
Ruben, under the status quo, the situation is getting better because a broad-based party has good incentives to form an interactive coalition. You disrupt that under our side, the cases are not fundamentally tense because the incentives then shift. How is an economic crisis likely to be triggered? The first reason for this is that when you disrupt old patronage networks, there's likely to be massive degrees of capital flight. Old patrons get really, really scared when a new party comes to power. Why? There's a massive degree of expropriation risk or assets being frozen by a bank because a new party often wants to differentiate themselves from the old regime to not just appear to be a puppet. Therefore, they often do things like freeze bank accounts and expropriate property, creating a massive incentive for the old patronage networks to strike first and to withdraw their assets from the country. This is absolutely terrible because it often becomes a bedrock of the economic system. These people are often rich and they literally fund banks, allowing them to have sufficient capital to lend out. They have massive degrees of corporate assets to sustain wider financial systems that are going to exist. This capital flight is going to be catastrophic and it becomes cyclical as speculators grow increasingly more scared. Secondly, you hugely increase the degree of policy uncertainty. Opening government is like, you don't like the incumbents. Maybe you morally disagree with them, since when did the West ever care about that? But you know the incumbents, right? You know what their policies ultimately are. You have intimate connection with the regime. You know how to bypass all the red tape in government when it comes to doing things like requiring a new business license that's going to exist. When you have your connections, you also get degrees of trust that there's likely to be things like policy continuity with the deals in the agreements that you ultimately form. I think this is especially problematic because new parties often engage in radical policy differentiation from the old party. Think about how shock therapy was after the fall of the Soviet Union, where you're just getting radical shifts between different systems that ultimately existed, also creating a crisis as well. Why is this a bad thing? First, it's just terrible for your quality of life of people like living within the state. I think that a massive crisis probably impacts you more than minor degrees of corruption. There's still broad-based incentives to not engage in like 100% corruption because you don't want people to engage in resolution. But secondly, it increases the probability that worse actors are going to come to power. There's this like bizarre assumption in the Gov case that like the good guy is going to rule into the future. Absolutely not. What happens when you fail economically and you trigger a crisis? Firstly, the incumbent will just be voted back into power during the next election, but it is worse than the old incumbent because now investors are scared that the incumbent is going to be voted out of power. The patronage networks have already been disrupted, so you get all the theoretical Gov benefits, but all our economic harms that we were discussing. Or two, the military comes to power and they stage a coup. Note this is extremely likely because the new government will have less resources when there is a crisis to pay off the old regime, and B, faith in democracy is lower when the new government is extremely shit. Military governments are worse because they have arms and don't need popular legitimacy. They often just kill a lot more ethnic minorities. Extremely hard to say in closing observations.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker for the opposition.
Our opening establishes only that corruption probably exists if a party has been in power for a long time, and they attempt to solve that singular issue, a set of instances in which these parties are actively trying to consolidate their power. What we do is establish 6 more ways that are far more important, that having a party in power for a long period of time ensures that power gets consolidated in that party, prevents opposition parties from forming. Those 6 reasons are as follows. Firstly, we establish that it kills opposition morale, because people who strongly support the opposition parties never see them actually win, so they don't bother turning out to elections, they don't bother volunteering, they don't bother trying to help out that party. Secondly, they monopolise access to institutional knowledge, because they're the only ones who know how to run ministries, they're the only ones who have experience operating in government. Thirdly, they capture all new and upcoming talent, because all the politicians that want to try and get in power choose the party that had a track history of winning. Fourthly, they have legitimacy for the reason that they have been in power for a long period of time, therefore they have huge amounts of familiarity, and people are more likely to believe the things they say than believe the things of an opposition party. Fifthly, because they become emboldened over time, they use the fact that they have a long history in power to get away with slip-ups because they can look back on that track history and not draw attention to specific instances of failures. And sixthly, it's because they force other parties to make concessions to them to try and get a benefit and getting more power from them. These are so much more impactful than just a singular mechanism of corruption. Firstly, because they exist in a broader number of instances. Secondly, because they cannot be fixed with things like regulation. And thirdly, because they occur even in instances where the dominant party is well-intentioned, tries to act in good faith, taking on the very best case presented to us by opening opposition. Next then, why does that extension totally defeat closing opposition? First, I'm going to address the response they gave to us. The one response they told us was that there's mechanisms for internal accountability, so other mechanisms for accountability are unnecessary. First response to this is, obviously on the comparative, being comparative, this is just far worse, for the reason that it cannot be seen in public. They are less likely to be critical within internal party operations. Those mechanisms are far, far worse. Just think logically whether this is intuitively better than the mechanisms that we bring you for accountability. Secondly, though, they occur in a bubble, which means that rather than having discussion between the people on the left and the people on the right, if you have a right-wing dominant party, internal accountability exists only on the right side of that scale, which means that dominant voices from the far right have a greater power than they would otherwise in a system in which you have two parties with the capacity for success. And thirdly, because this accountability often just happens in quite poor ways. For example, it doesn't necessarily look like a discussion. Sometimes it looks like active threats from people who have lots of power within that party, using the fact that they have lots of credibility, using the fact that they have connections within that party to threaten people who are trying to challenge them's career. And that is not a meaningfully good form of accountability that leads to good change. So with that response out of the way, I think all of our extensions stand. We've clearly been opening government on those grounds. And also, Then secondly, looking at the extension we heard in closing opposition. This was simply that they must be super radical and this will cause huge amounts of instability. First response to this. It is untrue that you necessarily have to be radical on the basis of race or ethnic tensions. Simply because race and ethnic tensions have existed in the past, there are numerous other kinds of policy through which you can differentiate yourself from an opposition party. That looks like, for example, if the party in power is far right, you can be a progressive party. If the progressive party is in power, you can be a right-wing party. It looks like, for example, calling out instances of corruption that have occurred in that party. Or it looks, thirdly, just standing broadly for change, noticing the fact that people at this point might be open to that sort of change. Or it could just be because a huge scandal has occurred, and this is your one opportunity to take party away from that power, even if you don't stand for something totally radical. Second response to this, though, is just that if they have won a fair election, as per the info slide, that suggests that a majority, if not more people, support this party in power, which makes it seem extremely unlikely they're catering specifically only to a small group of minority individuals. That would suggest to you they are differentiating themselves on other bases than purely aligning themselves with the minority ethnic group by doing other things like I discussed. The third response then to this is that they just have strong incentives to maintain stability and also the capacity to do so. That's firstly because they don't want the kinds of harms that this opposition bench wants to talk about. Similarly, if they believe that this would happen if huge amounts of instability occur, they probably do things like they make concessions to other parties. They don't engage in super radical policies once they get into power. They acknowledge the fact that if they engage in egregious actions that are too radical, this will cause instability, therefore they don't do it. If it is true that you believe this opposition bench and all these harms would occur, simply put, a party that got into power would not do them because they are not completely brain dead. Fourth response to this, though, is even in the worst case, if the worst harms occur and things like huge amounts of capital flight happen, there are other ways parties can deal with these kinds of issues. That looks like, for example, taking loans from the IMF, taking advantage of the World Bank, utilising the UN to deal with these kinds of issues of trying to get rid of companies, etc. They wouldn't necessarily have the worst kinds of things occurring, even if this had happened. I'll take a POI from opening.
All your list of harms only materialize if there is no other party in status quo. Even though BJP is dominantly in power, there's the Indian National Party who has seats in the parliament. So they're clearly not demoralized groups with no institutional knowledge.
Okay, sorry. Let me just step through this. Okay, imagine a world in which there exists an opposition party, taking that at the best, but that party never wins. And I'll go through the list of reasons again. Kills opposition morale. That party exists, but it isn't winning. Secondly, monopolizes institutional knowledge. That party exists, but it isn't in power, it doesn't run the ministries. They have more thirdly, they have legitimacy. You get legitimacy from having power, not just by existing. Fourthly, they become emboldened. That happens whether or not they exist in opposition party, it happens from being in power. And fifthly, and I think I've missed one there, but forcing other parties to make concessions, again, is something that happens even if an opposition party exists. Silly POI. Next, responding then to opening opposition. First claim they make is that there's incentive not to be completely terrible. I would note that all of this point does is, at best, explains why it would not be totally atrocious, but does not deal with the other kinds of instances, for example, things like structural oppression or inaction and inequality. And that's for the reason that you need big events to mobilize large groups, which means that these kinds of huge protests only occur in instances where something egregious has happened, not in the majority of circumstances. But secondly, because most people, especially poor people in developing countries, lack access to understanding of these kinds of structural issues, which are also far worse because of a lack of education, because of a lack of media coverage. This is, therefore, and secondly, responding to this even higher burden, this doesn't even necessarily stop these kinds of worst cases, like protests. Firstly, because it doesn't particularly matter if protests are occurring if average citizens either don't care about those protests or have other concerns and priorities, for example, the economy, getting tax cuts, schools for their kids, having better healthcare. But second response to this, they might just be able to stop those protests through the means of the state, for example, by labelling them as radicals, using their legitimacy. Secondly, they said they have more capacity to change. We flip this by explaining why this is a bad thing. If they have more capacity to change, we don't want it to consolidate over time. We want change to occur now so that you don't consolidate this power indefinitely into the future. The world under closing government is clearly the best in this debate. Clear closing government first.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call up the final speakers of the opposition.
When it was revealed that the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was essentially stuffing money under his mattress, the South African rand dropped 40% overnight. This is important for two reasons. Number one, it proves that there are mechanisms of accountability that people think are real, even in probably the example in this debate that is the most severe for our side, where they've been in power since the 1990s and have massive levels of control. But markets, economic consultants, everyone, thought there was such a risk of them losing in the next election when Ramaphosa was revealed to be corrupt, that they immediately pulled their money out of the rand. This proves the second thing, that investors really care about loss and stability. They will immediately pull money out of economies. They'll immediately write down investments because they are very, very afraid. I'm going to first talk about to what extent accountability even matters, because I think both Gov teams imply that bad things happen when you lose hope, or bad things happen when accountability is lost, but they never prove those things. Then I'm going to talk about radicalism and why it's likely to be the general political cleavage that exists, and then I'm going to weigh over opening opposition. The first thing to talk about is to what extent accountability even matters in the first place. Now, I'll deal with the alleged tension from opening government here first, which is there are historical traumas that exist that we apparently think go away. To be very clear, we think that dominant parties are good at keeping tensions which are still very salient to people under the rug because you prioritize other things. You prioritize your patronage networks, getting rich in the regime, or whatever. But there is a spark created by their policy, which is an election being changed, that reactivates those things because there are now political incentives to reactivate those narratives. The CG response was to basically not listen to Naomi's speech at all and say there will still be a left-right political cleavage in the country. Now, I will concede and be super charitable, this will happen in some cases, but the analysis was very clear out of extension, which is the left-right political cleavage has not yet developed in many of these countries because years of war, oppression, etc. have meant that every single party is going to say the things that they say constitute a platform. Listen to the Gov Whip. We're going to fight against corruption as our political platform. We can call out corruption and say it'll be different. Every party is going to do this because there is corruption. So the way that you differentiate yourself from every other party who could win is radicalism. And the easiest way to push radicalism is not to say we're going to expropriate all the property because this is unpopular or my business interests. It's to say you care about ethnic anger. They killed you in the war. They're vermin. And this rhetoric becomes the valuable political rhetoric that makes sense because politics is geographic. Ridings are geographic. Regional control is geographic. So it makes sense to appeal to the largest possible ethnic group that is not the current majority as a political path to winning. Their next response under this just says we need accountability because otherwise people lose hope. I have a couple of reasons why I think this is not true in the first place, other than the very powerful example I pointed out from the start. The first is that there's still an ability to politically galvanize because you think you can influence policy from the outside, right? You think that if you put enough pressure on the ANC, then they'll do stuff for your particular region. And in fact, this is one such way in which there are ethnic cleavages that exist that are ready to be activated because there are already parties that are pushing for specific sectional interests, which suddenly become powerful. But second, I reject in the first place that the only way in these contexts where you think that you can get into power and you get into political power is to join the main party. Because you could think the exact opposite. You're like, I'm going to be the first mover to not do this because all the other talent is going to the main party, but I could be the leader of a party and get a lot more prominence if I join the opposition. But last of all, it's just normative and ideological. Even if you don't think you have a political path victory, you want to represent your ethnic group and you want to represent your interests. So many people are still motivated for ideological or normative reasons to enter politics. But I also think that there is a very important flip under the second theme of whether radicalism matters, which is just to say, if OG and CG are right, and there is a power vacuum that is created where all the political talent goes to the main political party, then the OG analysis that currently the dominant political party has stacked the bureaucracy with their cronies, they build highways to stupid locations, should imply that there are going to be very few bureaucrats that are not in the pockets of that party that you can put into power as the new political party enters, because there is a lack of talent. What that implies is two things. Number one, that the mechanism from both sides, that you need a circuit breaker, does not actually work. Because what the circuit breaker demonstrates is the exact opposite. It demonstrates, we brought you stability, they brought you instability, you should keep voting for us in the future. And in fact, a brief exercise in the other party winning can show people how dark it is on the other side and how much better it would be to return to a glorified historical past where the dominant party can take back its narratives like the Rainbow Nation in South Africa, for example. So I think it's actually vastly more likely that we lead to those outcomes. But third of all, and on the economics, but before that I will take closing comments.
Yeah, the point of all of our analysis was not to say that this wouldn't happen, but to say that in the future, if it happens, it would be substantially worse. Even if this is a harm, it is one that is better to get out of the way now.
I agree, but look how creative that future framing is out of closing government. Like, this future cannot continually be indefinite. We pointed to examples like the ANC, like in Turkey, and so on, where there has been large-scale dominance for a very significant period of time where we should be seeing closing government's case materializing, right? Like, if they think that 30 years of pretty much unprecedented power is not enough for their case to materialize and for there to be no political competition and for no investors to think that anyone else could win, then I don't know what cases their case is actually likely to take place in. They need much more illustration to prove that. You know what, I'll take over next. Yeah.
This political party has good incentives to run this country in a better way than the previous one, even if you buy their characterization that they're using racist narrative because they have long-term incentive to be in power.
Yeah, I mean, may have good incentives, but your power vacuum analysis proves that they'll be very bad at doing this. I'll also point out that there are a lot of examples where it becomes very difficult. Look at Imran Khan getting kicked out of power in Pakistan, and then he mobilizes his patronage networks in power to make it so hard for that party to govern. But even if they had incentives to get into power, and then after they got into power, they have incentives to appeal to everyone, I have no idea why that should only apply on Gov's side, right? Like, that is literally contradicting the closing Gov analysis, that once you get into power on an agenda, you then have incentives to become like super radical over time. I'll take their youth wings example on this, on the third question of the future, which is, I actually don't think they've proven anything out of this other than to say that youth have less reason to be radical because they're further from the past, as opening government says. And why do the parties make youth wings? Not because they're actually good at turning youth into radicals, it's because they want to stop the youth from not wanting to be radicals and keep some of them in the party to be political talent. So I think it actually proved the exact opposite. On corruption and what you ought to care about, I think the economic harms that we pointed out from our side are very definite. Not least because they lead to significant risks of instability, like literally no response to the fact that in cases of Myanmar and Thailand, when this type of stuff happened, the military and patronage networks had significant interest in bringing back the government and reinstalling them, given that they were pretty much enabled under that system. But I think second of all, there are very real harms of capital flight and expropriation. The West may be able to substitute some stuff, like closing Gov's response is like the IMF will magically give you money. They don't magically give money to you when you are expropriating things and you are not aligned with their previous policy legacies and not keeping loans. The end point for this analysis is very simply that it's leading to very significant tangible economic harms that reverse their progress and harm people on the ground. For all those reasons, very glad to oppose.